I want to welcome everyone to our Distinguished Speaker Series. It's a true pleasure to welcome Professor Lauren Klein. I know she's in a circle of friends, and I'm delighted to see that, co-authors and other collaborators. Lauren Klein is the Winship Distinguished Research Professor in the Department of Quantitative Theory and Methods and English at Emory University, where she also serves as a director of the Emory Digital Humanities Lab and a PI of the Mellon-funded Atlanta Interdisciplinary AI Network. She's the author of 2 terrific books, one co-authored with our very own Catherine D'Ignazio, award-winning Data Feminism. We love the book. And she's already working on a great major next project, Data by Design, an interactive history of data visualization, which is forthcoming with the MIT Press. They have very good taste in academic work. And she's been a recipient of an array of terrific grants and fellowships, and we are really delighted to be hosting you and excited to be engaging with the work and in questions and in one-on-ones after, during the reception. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for being here. I can't believe at this time in the semester that all of you have actually shown up for a thing. That really means a lot. So today what I'm going to do is explore the question that you hear up on the slide about how words lead to justice. And I'm going to do it through a pair of projects that explore the changing language of 2 abolitionist movements. So the first is the original abolitionist movement of the 19th century, which culminated in the end of slavery in the United States. And the second is the Black Lives Matter movement, which is abolitionist in the contemporary sense, in that it seeks the dismantling of failed policies and structures and their replacement with something new. And what I'm going to show is by identifying words that change in meaning and then who is responsible for those changes, we can surface some otherwise invisible forms of labor, intellectual thought, and a political action that contributed to these movement successes. But one part of this talk is also showing how it's not exactly an entirely rosy picture. One of the main findings of this project has to do with the really vexed relationship between Black and white activists, and in particular, women activists, that has actually characterized both of these movements. And this finding has much larger implications for multiracial organizing and coalitional politics more broadly, and I'll come back to this point at the end. And then just one more thing before I get started. In terms of structure, like I know IDSS, my department, is very much of the genre. So I've set this up like a methods talk. So you'll see, there are some familiar components. There's like the motivation, the model, things like this. There's an extension. But as someone who comes to data science from the humanities, I've over time realized that my humanities training is like my value add. I'm not gonna out-model the modelers. So what I'm gonna try to do today as I work through the model is try to layer in a sense of what a humanistic approach to data science looks like. And by this I mean one that's really explicitly framed by historical and cultural context, and that intentionally enables field-specific theory to lead. And I'll say just one more thing I realized just as I was reviewing my slides. Because I'm doing 2 things in one talk, it actually is 2 talks. It's gonna be long. I will try to keep track of that, but I apologize in advance because there's way too much in here. So I'm gonna get started with some of this theory. So if you work on historical literature and culture, which is sort of my background, one of the main questions you're always asking yourself is, what are the stories that we know about the past, and why do we know these stories and not others? And if you encounter this in a more scholarly register, this is what's discussed in terms of the power of the archive. So you could think here of Foucault as the person who everyone thinks of when they ask these questions. I really like to look for guidance to the Haitian historian Michel Rolf-Trouillot. And in his terms, the question becomes, what are the forces of power that have shaped the construction of the archive? This is the physical archive, so it contains the documents that tell us about the past. Who were the people who created these documents? And then more profoundly, who were the people who did not have the power to create these documents? And these questions matter for historical research because the archive and the documents that it contains are the basis for all the work that we do. So if we don't have access to documents representing a particular perspective, it becomes a lot harder to tell that side of the story, right? And just as an aside, this is not a data feminism talk. However, I do think it's interesting to note that in our data feminism talks, we begin with a slide and a long preamble about a discussion very similar to this, which is about missing data. And so this is not missing data in the sense of like there's a chunk of data that's missing and you need to impute it. We mean like in a more conceptual sense, like the data is missing because it's not collected in the first place. And in data feminism, we also show how structural power is what determines which data sets are collected and which are not, which is really important because this actually over-determines which research questions you can ask about that data in which you cannot. And so the point we make there is that without sort of beginning with a structural analysis of power, you might not be realizing that you're preemptively foreclosing the scope of your research if you only start with sort of the data at hand. Anyway, so the question of who gets to tell the stories of the past, it's a pretty central one for anyone doing cultural history, which is sort of what I do. In terms of my own research, I've always been interested in an additional set of questions about the relationship between the people who get to tell the stories and then the people who actually did the work that the stories are about. And so it's this set of questions about, the work in the context of political change that takes me to these two sets of projects. So I mentioned before, there are two parts to this work. The first is on the abolitionist movement, the original one, and then the second on Black Lives Matter. These two projects are they are thematically linked, right? Both involve large-scale social movements that have to do with anti-Blackness and white supremacy. Both take abolitionist approaches to these issues, right? The former literally in the form of advocating for the end or the abolition of slavery, and the second conceptually in the stance that it takes towards abolishing systems like the current configuration of policing and of prisons that do not protect those they claim to serve, and crucially, opening up the space to imagine alternatives. And connected, though, to the questions that I just had up on the screen, both movements involved a significant amount of work. And this work took place over years, in some cases over generations, right? And this work was not performed only by individuals, but by communities and coalitions. And so the top level question going into this project was, could we surface some of this distributed labor if we were to essentially consider these archives or text as data? And our goal here was to be able to use this evidence to tell a new story or an additional layer of the story about the people who were actually doing this necessary work. And so just a quick sense of the scale of this data, and now I'm going to sort of shift to the historical portion of the project, and I'll get back up to BLM in the second half of this talk. The historical data set consisted of 300,000 articles. They drew from about 15 major abolitionist titles. We merged some of them together because they were edited by the same people. I'll come back to that in a minute. Now it's possible to purchase this data directly from the provider, but at the time they hadn't encountered anyone like me who wanted their data and not their website, so I had to scrape it, and that was a big mess and took literally years. Most of the newspapers were published weekly, but some were published monthly. So this meant that the data temporally was quite heterogeneous. And so you can see that from this chart. And we have some controls that I can talk about later that account for this. And then I should say here, so this early part of the project was co-authored with Jacob Eisenstein, who is now at Google AI, but used to be at Georgia Tech with me when we started this, and also a grad student, now actually a colleague of mine at Emory named Sandeep Soni. So just sort of to back up a little, what you need to know about the abolitionist movement is that it was constituted by a really wide range of actors. So this included both men and women, both Black and white people. And this was at a time of otherwise mostly fairly rigid social segregation. So it was unusual in this regard. The movement was also ideologically quite diverse. And so, like everyone generally agreed on the common goal, right? Like ending slavery, but there were vast disagreements about process and means, right? So there were some people who were like, it's really important that we build consensus, we work slowly, we try to bring in as many people as possible, even if this means moderating our opinions. And other people would say, like, look, we're talking about actual human liberty here. There's no room for time, consensus, or moderation when we're talking about freedom, right? We need to burn this all down, like literally actually burn this all down like yesterday. And all of these internal debates were documented in these newspapers. So you're looking at digitized versions of 2 of the originals right here. So like I sort of see like big eyes when you work on historical data. We start like a lot further back from than like purchasing data from a source. These newspapers, they're also like really fascinating media artifacts. So some things you should know about them along these lines. So first, these newspapers were like single issue newspapers, issue not like publication, but like a topic. And you knew what this topic was that they cared about and wrote about because they told you, right? So titles like The Liberator or The Provincial Freeman, these are explicitly anti-slavery newspapers. And so the intention is to publish articles about slavery and its abolition. They also indicated their intended readership, right? And this readership was also quite diverse. So it included both Black readers and white readers. There were newspapers that were explicitly targeted at Black readership versus white readership versus a mixed audience. And again, they tell you who they're targeting because of the titles of the papers. The editorial teams were also quite diverse. So there were both Black editors, white editors, mixed editorial groups, both men and women. And it was actually, as opposed to today, it was the editors who were producing most of the editorial content. Most of the articles were not signed by anyone, and it was sort of understood that it was the editors, if an article was unsigned, that had written the article. And then finally, and actually very relevant to this project, is that these newspapers predate our modern conception of copyright. So not like there weren't laws about copyright then, like people didn't even like think in terms of personal ownership of ideas written down. So editors would very liberally not directly copy, they would look at the text and retypeset it for their own newspaper. Articles that they'd read in other newspapers that they liked or wanted to sort of promote through their own print distribution network. And this was not only condoned, but actually actively encouraged. Newspaper editors would send copies of their newspaper to other newspaper editors, hoping that those editors would read the articles, like what they read, and then reprint them. And actually there's someone who used to be at Northeastern who's now at UIUC, who has a really interesting project just about like reprinting networks in the 19th century, actually with someone else at Northeastern who was still there, who was working on this project as well. Okay, so anyway, so if you take all of this sort of historical and media-specific context back to questions about the work of social change, so questions like, how did the end of slavery actually come about? Like who influenced this abolitionist discourse, and who actually was sort of doing the work of changing hearts and minds? It seemed likely to us that we would find some of these answers in this newspaper. And this hypothesis was actually supported by qualitative work on this subject. So this is like long pointed to lines like you see on the left. This is written by William Lloyd Garrison, he was from Boston. This is often evidence of how these newspapers sort of functioned as the mouthpiece of the movement. What else you need to know about Garrison? He was white, he was a man. When we tell the story of abolition, like in AP US history, there's usually a mention of this guy. Like he's the one name that we tend to learn about when talking about abolition and these newspapers. But then on the right, you see a very similar proclamation issued by a Black woman abolitionist named Marianne Shadd, who was and remains far less widely known, and she knew it, right? So you see, she's in an editorial saying, to colored women, we have a word, we have broken the editorial ice. So this narrower question that we were asking had to do with this question of labor and credit. So who actually did the work as opposed to who was remembered for it? And our intuition was that an attention to the literal terms of debate, so to language, would show us the ways in which Shadd's paper, as much as Garrison's, were shaping these conversations about abolition that were taking place at the time. So we were interested first off in what were these terms that we could sort of point to and say that there's some statistical significance here, who was shaping these terms, and then finally, what they could tell us about the larger process by which the end of slavery came about. So all of these questions, like the terms, how they're being mobilized, how they were changing, this takes me up to the model. And for this, we took a word embedding approach. So if you're unfamiliar with word embeddings, what they do is operationalize a very old linguistic theory from like the 1960s, 70s, called distributional semantics. So it's just this idea that the meaning of any particular word can be inferred from the context in which it appears. But what these embeddings actually are in a computational sense are vector representations of each word in a corpus or a data set that are learned through a neural network. So it gives you like a vector that represents a word. This project began before the advent of large language models. So the second part of this project is trying to sort of adapt this approach to that. Now what you can have with large language models is a vector representation of each instance of each word in a corpus, but here we're looking at like an aggregate representation. So for this project, what we did is we took one of the sort of basic, like, there's a library that does this, word embedding approaches so that it takes into account not only the context in which the word appears, but also the time at which the word appears, as well as its source, by which I mean like which newspaper did that word appear in. So at the top you see, this is just a formalization of like literally the thing that you can implement in a single line of code. But it's relevant, just big picture, because you can see that we're looking at, it's a model of probability, or a model of the probability of encountering each word token conditioned on its neighboring tokens. And then second, oh wait, I have a pointer here. Okay. Second, and sort of more importantly for our model, there's two parameters. So there's this v vector and the u vector. The v is the context vector, the u is the word vector. In large language models, a lot of attention gets played to this context vector because now we can represent the context with a lot more granularity. But what we were looking at the time was actually the input vector, or the word vector. What we did was just decompose it, right? So this is our little contribution down here. So this is this, that, those two things are the same thing. And we decompose the input vector into the sort of base embedding and then two residuals, one which represents the temporal component and then one which represents the source-specific component. Looking first at the temporal component, what this enables us to see is how the context of any particular word like justice changes over time, right? So you can see it enters this corpus or data set in 1831. It has this like very legalistic meaning, right? It's used much more in like sort of in the same way as like judges or trial or offense or request. But over time, as justice becomes the sort of more conceptual thing, it acquires like, again, like a more conceptual sense, right? So it becomes used later in 1865 at the apex of the Civil War in the sense of like universal or citizenship or liberty or things like this. Here's freedom, actually, which has almost this reverse trajectory. Or not reverse, but like it starts out being sort of like undifferentiatedly politicized, in the context of like country or people or own. But by 1861, it acquires this like very specific meaning, which does have this legal sense because people were talking much more about what did it mean legally to be free. But just sort of to take a step back, when we're talking about the changing terms of debate and what intellectual labor they might signal, it's changes in this type of ideological keywords. So like people, if you've ever heard of like Raymond Williams, he has that book Keywords, like this kind of thing, right? These like overloaded words that sort of stand for like a synecdoche for broader thinking about a particular idea or sort of point of contention or change. So in order to determine the source of each word change, we borrow actually a measure from another paper of Sandeep's. This was his independent work. I had nothing to do with it. But the basic idea is that if the embedding associated with a specific source is a better predictor of how someone else uses the word than the base embedding, then you can point to that specific source as a semantic leader. And then the next source that comes along that follows, and this is just like cosine similarity, that follows the leader instead of the base embedding, they become the fast follower. So, oh, I was going to say more there. Okay. So it's this basic idea is like who is really sort of pushing the discourse in a new way. And then we're also interested in who is paying attention to that leader and being like, people are talking about justice in this way that I hadn't really thought about before. I'm going to sort of think harder on that. I might republish their articles. I might sort of elaborate upon that in my own writing. And in that way, they sort of glom onto this new way of talking about a particular concept or idea. So that's sort of what we were going for there. And then since what you end up with are essentially like pairs of leaders and followers, you can aggregate them and treat them like a network. And so we played around with a couple of different ways to see if we could sort of pull out some meaning from this. And we ended up with a hubs and authorities approach. So if you know this from the web, this is actually built into PageRank. So this is, like in that case, hubs are sites that have a lot of outgoing links. So like they seem important because they have a lot of information. And if you go there, they'll sort of like point you out to things that are useful for you. And authorities are lots of sites that have incoming links. So links coming in. So like a lot of people are pointing to this one source as some sort of authority on a particular topic. So you can sort of take this concept and map it onto our leader-follower pairs, where authorities are leaders in the word changes. So the people who use this new word change first, and then the hubs are the ones who follow that, who sort of like glom on or just sort of decide to follow the trend that they have observed. So here are, this is the same chart, just plotted bigger so you can see it. Here are the newspapers plotted in terms of the words that they lead on or their authority score against their follower or their hub score. And what this gets us is a big picture view of who is shaping the terms of debate. So which newspapers were consistently responsible for introducing new or changed word meanings, and then which newspapers were consistently adopting these words from others. So if you think back to the two newspapers that I had up on the slide a little bit before, you actually do find Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, up there, up at the top in terms of introducing word changes that others would follow. So that's some like nice, like, you know, validity right there. But you also see Shadd's newspaper, the Provincial Freeman, up close to the top as well. And what's particularly interesting about this to me is that while Garrison's newspaper is up at the top, Garrison's newspaper is also further to the right of the chart. So he's also adopting changes from others, sort of an equal measure. So he's participating in this exchange. But you have Marianne Shadd's paper more to the left, still high up, but more to the left, meaning that she actually is doing much less of the following. She's really focused just on innovating in terms of language. And so this is, you know, like a new layer of evidence, like I said before, evidence at scale that Shadd really was doing this heavy lift of shaping the discourse. She was far more invested in promoting her own terms of a debate than she was circulating the ideas of others. So there's one other newspaper that I want to pull out, which is this one, the Lily. So this was a white women's suffrage newspaper, and originally we had included a couple of titles that were sort of around the issue of abolition, both because the women's suffrage movement and the abolitionist movement had this sort of like overlapping trajectory over time. We were also just interested in if we could find any evidence of words consistently sort of changing and flowing between these two movements. And there's actually been just there's like a ton of qualitative work looking at the relationship between these two movements. And one of the things that we know from this work, and also again, like just from the newspapers themselves, if you read them, that many white women suffragists who supported abolition for pragmatic reasons also made explicitly anti-Black claims. And so we end up with this really vexing question, which is like, what does it mean that the Lily, which was like a known source of this anti-Black racism, so you can go there, you can find Elizabeth Cady Stanton, for example, like saying things that are like really odious. But it's not just sort of lending tepid support to the abolitionist movement, it's actually influencing the language, which is really weird, right? And so this to me is a really prime example of how humanistic approaches enter back in, because really any satisfying explanation that we're going to have for how and why this was able to take place requires a really deep engagement with existing historical scholarship and about how anti-Black racism and these anti-slavery organizing efforts could in fact coexist. So, okay, I actually think I'm doing okay for time. Phew. So I mentioned before, we were doing a lot of this work in 2020. It was sort of like a 2019 into 2020 project. And so the Black Lives Matter movement was literally like exploding around us. And we saw a very clear parallel in terms of the goals of these two movements. So, point of fact, many of the BLM organizers were making this connection themselves. So this is a more recent book by Patrisse Cullors, who not only uses the term abolition, but also in the cover adopts the style of one of these abolitionist newspapers, right? Then there are the parallels in terms of language. So if you read the work on hashtag activism, for example, you find scholars like Sarah Jackson, Moya Bailey, Brooke Foucault-Wells, arguing for how discourse on Twitter sort of pushes the mainstream public sphere through language, right? In ways that force them to respond. So one example of this that you see is BLM taking up the idea of white supremacy as part of their platform over the years, as early as I believe 2016. And then in 2021, you have Joe Biden using the phrase white supremacy in his inaugural address. And he was apparently the first president to use that phrase. Then there are also structural parallels, right? So BLM was also led by Black women when it began in 2013. Cullors is one of them. But as we saw the sort of exponential growth of the movement, we also saw BLM being taken up first by white allies, like myself, and then by the mainstream. And, this is when we started to see these conversations about performativity, about like whether someone with the BLM yard sign could actually be trusted themselves to not be racist if they encountered a Black person in the world, right? Like these actually seemed very closely connected to some of these complicated findings that we had uncovered in our historical work. So we wondered if our model could tell us more about this story, but there were certain aspects of this approach that we needed to change. At this point, the project shifted. So Jacob went to Google. The we here is me. Initially, two undergraduates, Danny Reutberg at Emory, Debbie Olarunasola at Yale, and then Sandeep, after his postdoc just this year, came back onto the project. So now it's a reconstitution of the family. And so for one, just in terms of things that needed to change, it was really important to us that the project not be a situation where we took our model, like plopped in a second data set, and we were like, look, it's generalizable, which is like how you get published in CS research. You all know this to be true, right? We really wanted to take seriously the ways that Twitter in general, and Black Twitter in particular, has its own domain experts. So these are people who have theorized its network structure as unique. So here you see some of the people that we drew upon. Dean Freeland, Charlton McIlwain, Meredith Clark for telling us Twitter time is not linear, right? It ebbs and flows. In the case of BLM, it's incredibly bursty, so we had to devise a new approach that didn't require sort of evenly spaced time bins, which we had used, without really thinking too hard about that in the newspaper project. This is also a place where contextual embeddings become useful. We can flag that for later. But another thing that's turned out to be a huge technical challenge is how we define the equivalent of a newspaper title, or like what is a source, right, for Twitter communities. And so here we have Andre Brock telling us that communities on Twitter are defined by who is there and talking to each other at any particular time, right? And those communities can change, but it's the discourse that binds people together. And we wanted to take that seriously, but because we wanted to take that seriously, we had to reject pretty much all of the approaches that have been used to label and create Twitter communities that we encountered, which involved either static groupings or groupings that were created using information that came from outside of Twitter. You like a manual, like I Googled this person and I determined that they are in this kind of group. Where we landed was initially a sort of adaptation of Louvain clustering. People like Louvain clustering for social networks because it gives you a couple of really big communities and then a long tail that you can ignore. We used a seeded approach because we wanted to begin with the work that Dean Freeland had done on this Beyond the Hashtag paper, where he actually analyzed the first 18 months of Black Lives Matter and had some thoughts about who the core communities were. And we figured we would start with his labels of the types of communities that were there and who was in them, and then see if we could carry that forward. And And then the second thing we had to figure out was how to connect the communities over time if the people in them were changing. And we ended up actually, again, after like a very, very long research arc, coming back to another paper of Dean Freeland's on Syria that used Jacquard similarity to connect communities, to essentially match communities over time, to change them, to chain them rather. And so what this visualization is showing us is just the chained communities that we created with color indicating the time bin and then thickness indicating the Jacquard score, meaning that they're more similar to the community that preceded them. But one of the things that we realized we sort of had always known we would encounter, but became very profound when we were determining these communities, was that we still weren't capturing everyone who contributed to this project. So the communities, the only community that persisted across the entire span of 2013 to 2020 was our Republican communities. So I feel like what we know about Republicans, which is they are narrowly focused on a brand, now proven by science. The second one that had pretty significant longevity were mainstream media outlets because it was their job, like they actually got paid to stay engaged with current events and produce content. But the young Black activists who started the movement, many of whose Twitter handles we used to seed the original communities, they vanished entirely. Both online and at times in life. And this is for a number of reasons. And among them is the mental and at times physical toll of doing activist work, right? So they got harassed, they got threatened, in response, many of them deleted their Twitter accounts or took a break from the movement. And most profoundly, some were killed by the police themselves. And I think, as I try to remind my team, this is a really sobering example for like as fun as it can be to work on this sort of modeling problem, like figuring out like how do we do dynamic sequential matching or whatever. Like our data, it represents actual people, and the harassment and abuse that they're facing online is actually directly connected to real world harm. And I should say also like is in itself harassment. So I'm not trying to minimize that. So this is, sadly, like also a lesson that connects past to present. So here you see some additional writing by Marianne Shad from the Provincial of Freeman, where she talks directly about the significant emotional labor that's involved in her abolitionist work, as well as its personal and at times physical toll. So Shad's writing, again, it's in line with qualitative scholarship on this. So Angela Davis most famously, but more recently, people like Jennifer Nash, Grace Hong, others, they've long argued that abolition, sort of both in the past and in the present, are the results of really long and arduous intellectual and political labor of Black women. And that labor has exacted a real physical cost. And this is, to me, some of the reason why we need this additional work that contributes to the project of naming and crediting this labor, some of which is directly documented in the print record, but some of it, like Shad's oversight of her larger editorial project, is far less easily perceived. So, what I hope I've shown here today is a lesson how like people on the data science side of things might honestly, like increase the stakes of our research if we allow ourselves to be guided by humanities scholars, by the questions they tell us are important, and then by the context that allows us to make sense of our results. In terms of the questions about labor and credit that I started with today, like I hope this shows there's so many stories that we can tell with or without data when we start asking ourselves why it is that we know some stories and not others, why we have some data sets and not others. And actually about how asking questions about who is actually doing the work might point us to this whole set of new stories that we can unearth and that can sort of expand the sum of our knowledge about the past. More generally, I hope I've given a glimpse into the sort of creative possibilities and new ways of thinking that are opened up when we allow this humanistic theory to lead. They introduce complexity, to be sure, but they also, I think, more practically lead to results that are more likely to be incorporated back into these field-specific conversations if you're already engaging with the literature that these fields have produced. And I think that's actually a goal that we all share. And then finally, I think, I hope I provided a reminder that I think we cannot hear too many times about how behind the data there are people, right? These are people who sometimes offer their words and their content to us to be modeled and measured, but at times have their words analyzed without their consent by actors, including the state, but also academics. With or without their knowledge. So we always need to be thinking about potential harms as well as existing ones as we continue on our work. So that's the end of the formal portion of my talk today. Again, here are the people who have contributed to these projects: Sandeep Soni, Jacob Eisenstein, Danny Reutberg, Debbie Olorunnisola, and us again. Here's how you get in touch with me. Thanks.
Questions?
I'll break the ice, although I will also see you.
Oh, great.
Us don't want to dominate, so please jump in with questions. I'm really taken with the idea of treating word embeddings as if they were like citations, because I have all sorts of data structures where I've also tried to say, what is the influence of this author in some genre of writing where citations are not strong, or where citation norms are very different than academia, where we use Google Scholar counts to like roughly measure authority or something like that. I'm wondering about a couple of assumptions that I think it might rest on. One is that you have all of the data. So there's just like an omitted newspaper that is in fact the common cause of word shift sense. And the other is something like I'd call like delayed shifts in meaning, where someone uses a term, it doesn't get picked up very quickly, yet because it's written down, someone can read it that way later, possibly 100 years later even, and then pick it up, and sort of like the artist was not known in their lifetime.
Right. Yeah.
Causal impact over a certain duration is large. That seems more like a conceptual issue. It's like just what is the temporal scope of the data and what bandwidths do you look at? But I'm curious also how you think about the missing data on the.
Yeah, so this is actually, it's a really good question. It's something we talked about a lot, and especially like now that I'm in a department filled with people who do causal inference. Like we were intentionally, I probably didn't do it in this talk, but in the paper that we wrote on this, there's like the initial paper and then there was like the humanistic version, and then we're working on writing up the BLM stuff now. We were very intentional about not using the word influence. We were also clear about scoping. We chose this particular data set provider because they had actually hand-keyed some of the most important titles in this movement. And so I'm sort of like countering what I said before about the power of the archive. But like based on what I knew about the abolitionist movement, there were very few major titles that were not in this data set. And then there were a couple of ones that I was like, oh, I've heard about why people are interested in that one. So they had done a lot of the creation for us. It was also very pragmatic. I was at Georgia Tech. They don't pay for humanities databases. If you want a bigger one, you needed like tens of thousands of dollars, and we had like $2,000. So both Gale and ProQuest have bigger data sets that we could not access. We've thought about sort of redoing this with larger data. But because of that, we just, we thought like, what this tells us about are these newspapers, right? We're not drawing conclusions beyond the data set that we have, but we're telling you with statistical certainty that certain words clearly were used first in this particular context by this newspaper, and then a lot of other people used those words in the same way. Is there, all sorts of stuff going on outside that could have influenced all this stuff? Absolutely. But for within the confines of this data set, that's what we think is going on. And I also think this is another difference between, I think, sort of how you validate findings in the quantitative social sciences versus in the humanities, because in the humanities, all you want is always just to flesh out the picture, right? It's like you already sort of know what's going on, and you sort of want to accumulate evidence that helps you tell a richer story. And so in the case of Marianne Chad, there's like, she sort of coinciding with this, there's now like an anthology of her own work. There's a edited collection of essays on her contributions. Like, there was something in the water at the time we started this work that like, she was probably doing something more important than people had previously recognized. And at the point that we were like, oh, like all of her words, like we did like essentially just a permutation test, and like a lot of the Provincial Freeman words stuck and some others didn't. And we were just like, great, like we're done here. We found what we were hoping for. And then when you take this back to the humanities, that's what matters. And so I think like ideologically, this is like it's a big difference. But I think that that's kind of what matters.
My question flows nicely from this point, because I was going to ask you if it was a qualitative scholar doing this work, and having someone who knows the literature well, a historian of this period, and who could just kind of dive into some of these personalities or sample accordingly. Why would they not identify this? Like, why do we need the big data to just get at the mechanism? Why do we need the big data to just flesh out the mechanism? I'm asking this because a lot of our students, we're trying to be very creative in teaching them how to think about these methods, and to also, we very much highlight the mechanism aspect as well. So this is not to suggest otherwise, but I'm just wondering, since it's important about, you've been emphasizing the humanities, bringing that back in, how do you think why is this different other than like a validation exercise than what, a qualitative scholar would have done? And I'm just curious and actually.
Yeah, I appreciate this, because this is like the big critique of digital humanities, which is the field that I sort of came up through. It's like, does this tell us anything that someone reading a book could not already figure out from reading that book? And I think, this is actually, I think, where it comes back to the sort of feminist approach to research that I see, which is like very little research in the grand scheme of things is entirely earth-shattering or fills in a true gap, right? We're always just layering in more evidence and more information and more knowledge about a topic or a subject or a person who we think matters, right? And I actually think it's really important, and I can do this now, like as a tenured professor. I don't need to make giant claims being like, no one before has thought my thoughts before, right? So I actually think it's really important sort of politically and intellectually to say like, you're right, like qualitative scholars did recognize through that single line that I pulled out that Shad had a really hard time of things, and she was doing a lot more work than people gave her credit for. But I think it really matters to be like, here's more evidence for that. Like, here's more evidence at scale, right? And I will say, and I have a whole set of papers about this data set, and one of them is more topic modeling thing. And it was coupled with some archival research looking at a white woman editor, who I didn't talk about here because she edited the national newspaper that was intended as like a centrist, moderating, unifying newspaper. Like she's explicit, again, like she tells you this. She's like, I have chosen to try to unite these divisive ideas, right? And if you go look at her archive, you find these letters where she says like, oh, I'm so busy editing the newspaper, I don't have any time for writing. And she talks about, she's like, I'm trying to like organize the articles and cut them up so they fit, and like my compositor quit, so there I am like laying out the type. And I really like that, because that actually was a sign that, like, unlike with Shad, where you could go and read, like that one that I pulled out was from her farewell edit. She ended up quitting. In her farewell editorial, this was when she like unleashed, right? But the other editor, in part because she was more moderate, never, like, she didn't tell her audience that she didn't have enough time. But in her private letter she wrote to friends, like in long form, she complained about it a lot. And so to me, in that case, I was like, oh, here is actual evidence. Like, we don't have evidence of her intellectual output on the page, but we can sort of get a sense of her labor, her editorial labor from like 1 degree removed. And again, I think this is really valuable. And I think like the flip side is teaching humanities scholars why quantitative evidence matters and evidence at scale matters in a way that is not better or worse, but different from what you get from close reading. Like, that is a project that I'm heavily invested in, so.
And this isn't directly related to data, but I'm really interested in what you said about reprinting. And I was wondering whether there are modern sort of alternatives to reprinting, like retweeting or reposting that are relevant here, because that it seems like that's such a unique way of completely espousing another person's view that we use really frequently without thinking about it that much.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of direct parallels. Oh, and it was David Smith who I was trying to remember. In my mind, the only thing I was thinking was Noah Smith, and I was like, that's the wrong Smith. But it's David Smith. He's at Northeastern. He's doing all this reprinting work. But yeah, I mean, one of the things, I guess I forgot to say it, but I actually see a very direct connection between the way that these newspapers sort of, by reprinting, were essentially like either retweeting or quote tweeting, you know, because a lot of times they would be like, this article comes to us from the Missouri Statesman, and we like how it does this, that, and the other thing. Like, that's totally a quote tweet, right? I mean, it's longer form, but it's the same kind of thing. I mean, other people like to bring in like zines and physically cutting out and pasting newspapers, and there's like a long history of that too that runs more in the like the manuscript tradition that runs alongside this. But I think the larger point that I would maybe say is that most of our media practices are not wholly new. And actually, this is connected to what I was saying to Fotini, right? Like, people have always experimented between the relationship between what seems to be like the static, permanent output and what they think about it. And they've used different mediums and sort of played with those media in order to overlay their own opinions on those, right? And those are all, they're all really valuable. Well, it is, again, like complicated when you end up trying to decide like how you want to determine what language use means, because it's like, do you include like the retweets, because you can do that even if you're pretty lazy? Do you include the quote tweets? Those take some effort, you know. So like there are additional considerations that are medium specific, where we really need to say and also look to other scholars who have done this work and be like, what do people do in this context, right? In our project, we removed the retweets because you're like, you can just do that like on the train, but we kept the quote tweets because we thought that that did, like, someone cared enough to put their little stamp on what they thought it meant.
Because I'm
Here, why don't you use the mic?
Okay. So thank you for your talk. And it's more like a comment because I'm researching like the transnational movements about abortion rights in Brazil and Argentina, and I am using this theoretical framework on the diffusion of norms. And while I was listening to you, I was thinking also how your data actually show how because I'm thinking the norms in the international relations theory, it's about ideas, how values, ideas, beliefs, they spread, let's say, over time and for a specific issue. So I was thinking how your data actually can maybe show another face of a discussion that's already happening for a long time in the humanities, but how this like, the specific idea about abolitionism also change over time, and also how, because it's very interesting because the slavery is given as an example of a norm that's taken for granted in the international, let's say, scenario. And how you bring it, I think it kind of brings to discussion again how these norms are being maybe contested. So your data also could like, I don't know, update even the theory I'm thinking about, you know. So I think it tells another story in another way.
Yeah, no, yeah, it's really amazing. I mean, I do think, you know, again, like the question about, I think this sort of speaks to your question of like, or the question that I have, which is like, what is the justification for using words to stand, like, why am I putting so much weight in these words, right? But I do think that there are, well, I guess two things. One is there are certain words that do really matter, right? Although there is a great piece, Naomi Klein just wrote a piece in response to Palestine about how words don't matter anymore, which I nearly had as a slide, but I didn't want to, that would have been like off to the whole other topic. But I actually do think that, like, even if not everyone saying the words believes those words, some people saying the words do believe them, and having words in the discourse inflects how people think about issues. Like the big one that I think is really interesting is the idea of defunding the police and the concept of defunding, which, like, when it was introduced, got people really worked up. It ultimately ended up being sort of a fail, like the left failed to convince the mainstream that defunding the police was a valid means of addressing sort of like the carcerality of the United States, right? However, people are still talking about it, right? Like they're still like, oh, we don't like that thing, but we, but like, so it really did, like the word itself and the concept really did get people going, even if it didn't necessarily lead to, with the case like in most national policy, long-lasting change. The other thing I will say though is that, and I didn't talk about that in this talk, is that a lot of the words that like passed the permutation test were not actually like ideological words. There were just a lot of like common words, and a lot of them don't really have a clear explanation for why these words tended to be used. They were sort of like verbs that often were used to describe a movement, or like an adjective that showed up more in a particular context, that if you saw it out of context, you'd be like, I don't know what this means. But I think, that's a whole level, like that's sort of more of a, like someone in linguistics needs to make that argument. But I do think that there is something just about like discourse in general, and about how even if we can't point to specific words like abortion or like abolition, there is a way in which people communicate that is sort of inflected by these topics in ways that is subtle on the one hand, but potentially really profound, right?
Thanks so much. I'm curious, I guess, two things about the data set. One, the ways in which you feel that like newspapers and the written vernacular in particular completely or otherwise represented the movement during that time. And then the other was just, and you sort of alluded to it, I was having OCR nightmares until you mentioned that it was retyped, sort of just broadly the experience of assembling the data set and how that went.
Yeah, those are both really good questions. So to answer the first question, so in general, historical newspapers have been very poorly preserved. No one knows how many there were. Nobody knows what proportion of them have been preserved, mostly because they end up being like in the basement of a church or in someone's attic. And it's not until the person living in that house or taking care of that house now discovers that they have them, that they end up being brought to like a library or an archive. I think the current estimate is like only about 10% of the newspapers that were published exists now, and that isn't even how many have been digitized, right? So we're already working with like a pretty weird subset, and like who, like talking about confound, like who knows why we have certain news. I mean, we know why the major ones were kept, but like a lot of the other ones, why do we have those and not others? It is totally due to chance, right? And that's just a circumstance that anyone who does, there's like a whole field of periodical studies, qualitative as well as quantitative, like it is what it is. The interesting thing though that I think complements your question is there's a really good project called the Color Conventions Project, which is run by a team now. They're at Penn State. They used to be at University of Delaware. And they have digitized the transcripts or the meeting minutes of in-person Black-led organizing meetings that took place in churches weekly and monthly. There were like regional, national conventions. And these were, again, like Black-led. There were, I'm trying to think, there's like, a handful of white people who ever were invited to attend, but this was entirely closed to, and I guess their meeting minutes were sometimes published in the newspapers. And so part of what the Color Conventions team has done is through keyword searching, but also just reading, try to identify all of the conventions' meeting minutes and then transcribe them and create their own corpus data set that you can work on. You can download it from their website. And there's actually, Jim Casey's done an interesting network analysis of just like the people who sort of traveled around to these different meetings and may have brought ideas, from different states to another. So like there's all these dimensions that we don't know about. This is totally only one dimension of all the organizing work that was happening. In terms of the process of assembling the data, one of the nice things about, there were financial constraints, but also this is the only newspaper data set that is not only hand-keyed, but also segmented by article. All of the OCR data is by the page. And now it turns out, actually, there's someone named Ben Lee at UW. He actually has used some new image models to automatically segment the pages into articles. But until like last year, if you go to the Library of Congress, they just have people who are like manually drawing squares with this software that, like, I've seen it, it's totally nutty. Like that's how they could represent in metadata like what the bounds of the article box was, and that was like state of the field until 2022. And so our project we only really could have done on this data set because of the article rather than page level segmentation. And I guess, I don't know, I mean, there's boring stuff. It's like they hand keyed it, but they also like hand coded their HTML. And so it like broke beautiful soup when I tried to strip out the HTML tags. Like it turned out it was like, on the one, it was like both a blessing and a curse that there were humans behind creating this data set, because it led to just like lots and lots and lots of extra challenges that I didn't anticipate.
We're going to thank the speaker.